Welcome to Let's Talk Learning Technology. Do you know the latest in learning technology? Matt and Walter do. From learning authoring tools and animation to virtual reality and everything in between, innovative learning groups Matt Kurtin and Walter Schirmacher geek out on all of it. Get their perspectives on the latest trends, tips and tricks, and recommendations so your learning tech keeps up with the times.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Learning Technology, or as we affectionately refer to it, LT Squared. I'm Matt Kurtin, ILG's Senior Director of Technology and Visual Design.
And I'm one of ILG's programmers, Walter Schirmacher.
Today we're talking about Storyline, which is one of my favorite general-purpose authoring tools for e-learning. We use lots of other tools as well, like Rise and Captivate and historically Lectora, those types of things. We like to use Storyline because it's easy to use and you can do a lot with it. Walter, how many courses do you figure you've worked on in Storyline?
Millions? No,
Millions.
No. I've worked on several hundred.
Probably in the thousands, maybe. Hundreds or thousands, at least hundreds, I'll say.
Yeah.
Well, with that many, however many it is, I'm sure that you have enjoyed working on some and some weren't as much fun.
Well, there's always that, but it's a fun tool to work in.
So let's focus on some of the fun ones. Today's episode is going to be about tips and tricks for Storyline. And I'd like to start out with some of the advanced ways that you use slide masters, beyond just using them to lay out the visual look of the slides. What are some of the ways that you've used code in slide masters?
You can use code in slide masters?
You can indeed use code in slide masters.
I had no idea. No, I've used code in slide masters. It's a great place to put JavaScript functions because then they're only in one spot and you don't have to worry about updating them. If you have like the same function you want to use over and over again, you can actually put it in the slide master, refer to it, and then call it from anywhere in the course, which is great. I've seen it used before Storyline added page numbers. We used to use code for that. And you can actually do some crazy things with it. We've done calculations of like course progress using code in slide masters, and we've done other things. And we'll get to some of those later on when we talk a little bit about states and such.
Yeah, I think that idea that anything that you're going to reuse over and over again, general programming principle, dry, don't repeat yourself. If you can put that code in one place and reuse it, that's awesome. I know another thing that you've done is to embed custom HTML pages into Storyline web objects so that you could take your interactivity to another level. One example I know we did was a card sorting activity that allows a lot more flexibility than a normal drag and drop. Can you talk about how when you're using Storyline web objects, you can not only adjust variables, but you can also trigger actions to take place back in Storyline from within the web object?
Sure. I think web objects are one of the more powerful things of Storyline because it not only lets you keep within the Storyline interface, but it actually lets you embed objects like web objects, PDFs, websites, and all kind of crazy stuff you can put right into the course, which is really, really nice. And then Storyline keeps it as part of the package. I've used other tools where it's always separate and you have to like add it to the published course later. So it's nice that it includes it. Before we get into the interactivity you talked about, one tip for using web objects is if you add a web object and then you make a change to it, you can't just browse to it and link to the same folder because Storyline won't realize, hey, this is different. If you actually change the folder name slightly and then relink it, it'll actually update the web object.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about there. What I typically do is make another folder, just a folder that has an index.html in it in the same folder as the one I'm going to be updating, and just call it something like remove later or delete. And that way, when you reload, you can switch from the one you're really working on to that one and then back. And that way you don't have to change the name of the folder you're importing the web object from.
Cool. That's a great tip, too. So one of the things I like to do is I like to use variables. And I'll set the variable first in Storyline, and then I'll go into like the code in the HTML page or whatever I'm embedding. And I'll actually then, when whatever it is completed, I'll actually set the variable using some JavaScript code that then gets detected by the onChange trigger action, and then I can respond to that action. For example, I had a page where the person had to scroll all the way to the bottom to make sure they looked at the whole PDF. And so I actually detected when they finished scrolling. And then when they did, I then changed a variable that then Storyline detected the change happened, and then I unlocked the button.
Yeah, and because you can use that on change of the variable to trigger an action, One of the things I like to do is use a Boolean variable for that, so that then within the changes in JavaScript, you can just change it from true to false or false to true. That ability to toggle that variable and know that every time you reversed it, it's going to trigger the change. Or I suppose you could use a number and just ensure, but you'll need to make sure that when you change it, you set it to a number that it already wasn't before in order to cause that change to happen.
No, that's
cool.
true.
It seems like you could also use that toggling approach not only with the Storyline web objects, but in the code that you were talking about before for your slide masters. If you wanted to trigger some action in the master, you could change a variable in order to call that code defined in one place from multiple places. Actually, you used that on a project that I worked with you before on a fly-out menu where we wanted to have the menu pop out. We put the menu into the masters and then caused that to happen.
Yeah. I actually like the toggling. Sometimes when you have a lot of variables you need to check, it will be like 10 or 12 things that have to happen on a page. And then when you come back to the page, you have to see, are all 10 or 12 of these things done? It can be a lot of triggers in Storyline. And so sometimes if you have like a completed variable instead, what you can do is you can actually then check for all like 10 or 12 of those variables to be done and then mark that variable complete or true if you're using a true-false variable, which is great. And then when you come back to the page, you only have to check that one variable, and then you can trigger your code in the slide master. So that's a lot simpler coding than if you're having to come back to the page and check all of the variables.
Yeah, I think anytime you're looking at a long list of triggers that are happening sequentially in a row and the list is getting longer and longer, the more likely you might be able to program it more efficiently if you put a little bit of JavaScript in there that did the calculations instead of all those consecutive sequential triggers. So moving on to the next topic, how about advanced approaches for dealing with slides that you've revisited a second time? So if you think about the options, you could set a slide either to reset to initial state or resume save state. But how could you use variables to generate more options beyond those two?
I generally only use resume save state for quizzes. Otherwise, I will use reset to initial state, and then I will use variables actually to reset the page when they come back to it. That gives you a lot more flexibility. A good example would be if you have some buttons on the page and you maybe have some branching, and when you come back to the page, you want to change how the buttons look based on what parts you finished and what parts you haven't. It can be nice to use variables for that and then say, hey, did I finish these sections? And then you can actually customize the look of the buttons to show your progress. If you just resume save state, it'll just show you whatever state the buttons were in, and you get a little less flexibility with that.
Yeah, I think with that idea of using the variables and reset to initial state, then you can have some parts already marked completed and other parts that not. And a big benefit is that if you use resume save state, it's going to cause the replay button not to work. When they click the replay to try to replay the audio, it just won't play. And then what you mentioned on the quiz about using resume save state, you really do need to do that if you want to be able to have the learner be able to go back and review which answers they got correct or incorrect, because that function will not work properly if you use reset to initial state. So that's a place where you really do need to use it if you want to allow people to review the quiz results.
I know you're asking the questions today, Matt, but I'm going to ask you one.
All right.
What do you think about the auto decide option in Storyline for letting it pick between those two, reset to initial state and resume save state?
I feel like you're asking that because you know how I feel about it. So I do not like to use the automatically decide, because then you never know what it is going to decide, whether it's going to choose reset or resume. I'd rather have that be clearly picked out, that we're going to get what we want instead of letting it guess, and it might be the opposite of what we want.
Yeah, that's usually a good practice. Even though it takes a little more work to set it, I think it can be a very powerful thing. And then if you can multiple select on all the slides, and you could actually select them from the Storyline interface, and you can set them all to reset to initial state.
Yeah, an extra tip there would be when you select a slide in a scene and you select Control-A to select all, it's only going to select what's in that scene. But if you hit Control-A a second time, it will then get all the scenes. And as long as there are no question banks, you can set these properties for reset to initial state and resume save state across all the selected slides at once. But if you have a question bank mixed in there, you need to deselect that first, and then you can set it for everything at once and then come back to the stuff in the question bank.
While you have everything selected, you might as well also set it to not auto advance.
Yes, although on that one you want to be careful. If you know that none of the slides need to auto-advance, you can do it in that way. But in some cases, if part of the course is supposed to auto-advance, when you finish, like in an audio ends or a video ends and it's going to move forward, then you don't want to accidentally turn that off. Right. But a good tip for how to do it if you know that it needs to be set that way. Yep. How about when you're organizing your interactivity within a page? How do you decide between layers, states, and groups for how you want to kind of chunk things up and organize them?
I generally will use layers for a lot of things, especially if it's something where you're going to want to have some animation or have some audio on it. They're more like traditional web layers where you could actually go and then show something and hide it.
What you mean there is because when you have the layers, it has the timeline still, yes. Right? And you wouldn't have that in the states or groups. Okay, yes. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's true. I don't like to embed audio in objects because it's really hard to find it later on. And then you have no control. You get no audio player, which can be really annoying. Putting audio in objects is okay if it's like a quick sound or something. Otherwise, I prefer to put it on a timeline. Mm-hmm. Groups are really useful when you want to have a group of objects animate all in the same way. I like to use states not only for their traditional use for like buttons where you can show the on, off, whatever, or hidden. I also like to use them to show a series of changes to an image. For example, if you have an image and it's going to get rotated and then moved a little bit and you want to show a series of progressions on that. For example, maybe you have an image of a machine and it starts off on the left, and as you like drag a slider, you could show it going across the screen and rotating and moving and maybe zooming in and out. You can preset all those changes using states, and then as you slide the slider, you actually can then change the state on that. And of course, the nice thing is it's only one image because Storyline's making all those modifications for you. So you don't have a whole huge set of images trying to load onto one page. I think states should be used more often.
What about the idea when you want to show or hide stuff? I think that also can help make that decision. Like layers has that functionality to hide other layers. So if you know that you want to be the only thing showing, it's great to use that function of the layer. But states can be useful too just for hiding a bunch of stuff at once. If you put it all in that state, it just takes one trigger to hide the state with everything in it. Versus if you had separate items, even in the group, you still would... you get a pro and a con, right? You get the benefit that you could hide some of the things in the group and not others, but then responsibility to hide all the things in the group.
Yeah. I mean, layers are nice, especially like you said, for hiding multiple things. They're great for the traditional pop-ups or if you have the rollovers or hovers or those kind of things. Whereas states can be nice when you want to, when you want to embed text with an image or something, you can actually do that in a state by putting it right in there. It can get a little tricky during editing trying to figure out where the text went. But, once you figure out, it's in the state, then you can do it. You just have to be careful with states because if you make a change to a state and you make a change farther down in one of the states, it doesn't always go up. So then you might have to manually I have 100 copies of this text and I've changed the 98th version of it, but I forgot to change the other 97 versions of it. So you have to be careful, though, with that. But search and replace can help with that, too.
Talking about layers, I know one of the new features that just got added recently was the ability to convert a layer to a modal layer. And I haven't had a chance to use it in a project yet, but looking forward to doing so. I like the fact that the modal layer has the ability to put the cover over automatically, so you don't have to put a transparent box. And that cover can cover the navigation controls like the seek bar as well, which is something we couldn't do before with layers, even if we did put a transparent background behind or a semi-transparent background behind. I guess keeping up with those feature lists as they come out, like every time they come out roughly monthly with new features, I always like to look at that list and review what's there to keep up with what's new. I remember you were looking recently at the 360 images feature as well. That's not quite as new, but fairly new.
Yeah, it's something that I've gotten to use a little bit on some projects, and I'd like to see it used more and more. I think it can have some pretty powerful implications when you can put it in there and then make use of it, and you can really show, hey, I want to look around this room, or I want to look around this object or whatever, and you can do some really cool things with that. Yeah, Storyline's always coming out with new things. It is best to keep up on what's new.
And then another thing I wanted to talk about is spots where you could use hotspots instead of those transparent boxes, because I know when you make a box transparent so that it can cover, like be a blocker to cover something up, or it can be a target area, then you can't see it at author time as well as at runtime, and you had found about using hotspots instead. Can you talk a little bit about how you do that?
Yeah, I actually found that on a recent project. I was struggling. I had this drag and drop that had a large number of really small drop targets, and I had to make changes to them and move them around a little bit and line them up pretty precisely. And it was really, really hard to see with the transparent shapes. And I kept making them untransparent and then ranking them transparent and back and forth, trying to get them lined up exactly. And I realized I could actually use hotspots for that. The nice green outlines there, you can line them up really precisely. And they work really well as hotspots. You just have to make sure you uncheck that show hand cursor on hover. If you don't want that, if you want to accidentally, show them and give people the right answer too easily.
Yeah, it's like exactly what the doctor called for: visible to you at authoring time, but hidden at runtime.
Yeah, they're actually pretty cool. Hotspots can do a lot, and especially with the drawn hotspots, where you can hand draw stuff, those can be really cool.
Well, Walter, I think you've given us quite a lot of tips today, ranging from places to put code in different spots and different ways to organize the slide interactivity. Listeners, if you have advanced storyline tips and tricks you'd like to share, or any learning technology topics you'd like for us to talk about, you can message Walter or me on Twitter. You can also send us an email at marketing@innovativelg.com. For a sample storyline file that illustrates many of the items we talked about today, see the resources section for this podcast on our website.
Thank you for listening. Tune in to our next episode, in which we'll talk about quality assurance testing.